All right, pre-AP biology. This is the second lecture on Introduction to Ecosystems, which I will be giving in class this week. But for those of you who are quarantined, hopefully you're doing okay. Make sure you watch this, or if you've already seen this lecture, you want to watch this again to help you study. That's probably a good idea. We're going to go ahead in this PowerPoint and kind of, before I do that, I want to just kind of quickly review a couple quick things with you. We talked about symbiosis the other day. Make sure we understand, what symbiosis is, right? It's the relationship when two organisms are kind of living together. So, again, like in a pond ecosystem, there's a whole bunch of symbiosis going on, right? There's interactions between all these different organisms. The other day in the first lecture, I went over the first three with you. So again, make sure we understand what commensalism is, right? It's that plus zero relationship, where one organism benefits, the other one is neutrally affected by it. So like the clownfish and the sea anemones was a good example of that. Mutualism as a plus plus, right? Both organisms benefit. I gave several examples in class. The zooxanthellae and the coral polyps. There is a video assignment about this particular type of mutualism, which is kind of an interesting one. And then we finally finished up the other day. We talked about parasitism, which was a plus minus. Again, one organism benefits, that would be the parasite that benefits, and one organism is negatively impacted. In that case, it would be the host. All right, so I'm going to make sure we understand those three. Now, today we're going to do the last two types of symbiosis, and the first one is predation. Now, when we think of predation, right, I mean these are kind of some images that sort of come to mind. Sharks eating a seal, or a lion eating a zebra, whatever, right? These are kind of classic examples of predator prey. But one thing I want you to understand about predation is it's a plus minus, right? I mean, it's not too difficult to understand that the shark is benefiting and the seal is not, right? The seal is going to die. So, one thing about predation is it's kind of similar to parasitism in that it's a plus minus. But the big difference between parasitism and predation is that in predation, one of the organisms dies, right? I mean, it's food for another organism. In predation, correction, in parasitism, one of the organisms doesn't typically die, it just suffers. So that's kind of the big difference between predation and parasitism. Prey is food, right? And the predators consume the prey. So make sure we kind of understand the terminology there. Says here as the availability of prey fluctuates. So, for example, let's say the bear is eating the fish. If something happens to the fish, that might affect the number of bears. If the bears don't have any food, then that might affect their numbers. So, the predator and prey populations are constantly sort of in flux. Right? Sometimes they're going up, sometimes they're going down, but they're related to each other. Herbivory. This is a specific type of predation. Whenever we think of a predator and a prey, we typically think of two animals. But sometimes you can have the prey as a plant. In this case, like for example, this little like bush pig here is eating this cactus. Probably not a good idea for him to do that because he's probably going to get a face full of thorns. But when animals consume plants or consume producers, that's actually kind of a specific type of predation that we don't really think about. But plants have actually evolved a lot of their defense mechanisms because of this type of predation. So there's a little video in one of the lecture note reviews today that's all about plants and how they sort of defend themselves and how they've evolved defenses against predators, because if they get eaten, then they're going to die, right? So some plants have spines or thorns or produce toxic chemicals, that type of thing, to kind of ward off predation or different types of predators. All right. This is something I kind of want you to be sort of familiar with. It's a certain type of graph. It's a predator prey graph. And this graph looks a little bit different from a lot of other things that you may have seen before. Um, so whenever we see one, and you're going to see a predator prey graph in your next quiz. So I want us to kind of be familiar with it. The first thing that we always should do when we're looking at any graph, I don't care if it's a predator prey graph or a pie chart or a bar graph or whatever it is always read the title, right? In this case, it's a wolf moose predator prey graph. So just by reading the title, that should give you some idea of what this graph and all these numbers are representing. You don't just like dive right into the numbers and dive into the graphic. Actually try to read the title before you look at anything else. The next thing you should probably do is look at what each axis represents. For example, down here on the x-axis, we have a period of time. Looks like it starts in the year 1900, goes up to 2000, maybe a little bit past that. But mainly, on the x-axis, we're talking about around 100 years of time. So always make sure you're looking at that and understanding what is that axis telling us. Now, on the y-axis, you'll notice that there are two of them. All right, so for example, on this y-axis on the left, this is the wolf population numbers, which are represented by the blue line. So, for example, in the year 1900, we can look at the blue line and look at this axis over here on the left. We can kind of tell that there was about, I don't know, maybe 17 wolves in that particular year. And you can pick any year you want. I mean, in the year 1920, right, it looks like there was around 50, 51 or so wolves. So you can kind of tell by this graph that the number of wolves is kind of fluctuating, going up and down, up and down. Looks like in the year 1980, it kind of came to a low, maybe around 11 wolves or so. Now, the other axis is the moose, right? So, in the year 1900, for example, we're going to look at the red line here. If I asked you how many moose were there in the year 1900, here's a common mistake a lot of people make. They'll look at this point right here and they'll say, oh, there was about 57 moose in the year 1900. Well, you're looking at the wrong axis. If you want to find out how many moose there were, you got to go all the way across to the other side, probably about 1,500 or so. All right, so you got to make sure you use this axis for the moose, and we're going to use this axis for the wolves. So, like for example, in the year 1920, we would probably say there was about, I don't know, maybe a little bit less than 800 moose that were in that area. Make sure you understand which animal's the predator, which animal's the prey. I think looking at the two choices that we have here, it's probably safe to say that the wolves are the predator and the moose are the prey. Another way to figure that out is just look at the numbers. Typically the predators will be in much lower abundance than the prey is. So that's kind of a dead giveaway right there. Describe the trends in population data over time. By looking at the data and kind of what it's showing us, we can see that these predator prey populations are going up and down, right? I mean, they're fluctuating, or we have a special word for that called oscillating. So for example, the predator, from let's say 1900 to 1920, that population is going up. But look at the prey population from 1900 to 1920, it's going down. So it seems like when one's going up, the other one starts to come down, and vice versa. When one comes down, the other one goes up again. So there's a reason why this is, and it's a concept called negative feedback. Negative feedback basically means that there's two organisms that are kind of dependent on each other, right? And as one of their populations goes up, the other one tends to go down. But then when the other one goes down, the other one starts to go back up again. So that's why we see this constant fluctuation like this. Anytime you're looking at oscillations, when there's like a predator prey graph, that typically tells us that it's some type of negative feedback, right? One's going up, other one's going down, vice versa. All right, now the other or the last type of symbiosis is competition. And competition is a negative negative. And you might think that this really wouldn't be the case. I mean, if you've got two organisms that are competing for a resource, you might think, well, one of them is going to win and one of them is going to lose. But that's not, I mean, that kind of is the case, but there's a little bit more to it than that. To explain this, I'm going to show you a very famous experiment called the Gauss experiment. This is a really important one. You'll see this again, most likely on a quiz. We're going to start up here at the top in this graph. And what you're seeing here is a specific species of paramecium. Paramecium are little protists, they're little microorganisms. And in Gauss's experiment, what he did was he put these paramecium in a little petri dish, and he gave them food and water and all the things that they need. So, for example, take a look at this axis here, right? This is days. And on the left, on the y-axis, you've got the number of individuals. So let's just think about what happened. These are asexual reproducers. So at the very beginning, there was very few Aurelia, right? There wasn't too many of them. But eventually, over time, their numbers started to go up and up and up and up, right? So they were reproducing. There's plenty of them. But then eventually they started to, kind of level off. Okay, and it looks like they kind of leveled off at about 200. So we have a special name for that. It's called the carrying capacity. So when these paramecium were grown by themselves, they can kind of grow to a maximum of about 200 individuals. Okay, whatever. Now the second graph is showing you a different species of paramecium. This one up here was called Paramecium aurelia. Now this one here is a completely different species. It's called Paramecium caudatum. And the same experiment, right? He ran this experiment, and then, again, these paramecium were put in a different petri dish. They were given food, and their numbers again started to increase and increase and increase, and they started to level off again. And now they leveled off at about maybe 130. So their carrying capacity is about 130. So when caudatum are grown by themselves, their carrying capacity is 130. When Aurelia are grown by themselves, their capacity is about 200. Now, the third experiment is kind of interesting because in this experiment, the two paramecium were grown together in the same environment. So obviously, they're going to compete. Now, this type of competition is what we call interspecific. That means they're competing with each other. The Aurelia are competing with the caudatum. The caudatum are competing with the Aurelia. So let's take a look at what happened, right? So initially, the first couple days, we had some growth, and then the Aurelia seemed to continue, and the caudatum looks like it declined. So if you're looking at that, you're probably thinking to yourselves, well, yeah, the Aurelia won. Like they won this competition with the caudatum. The caudatum seems to be losing. And that's true, that is happening. But I want us to think about the Aurelia here. If you look at the carrying capacity here, right, it's only about 150. Whereas when they were growing by themselves, it was 200. So even though the Aurelia is winning this competition, there's a there's a toll that the Aurelia take, right? I mean, there's a sense of loss. There's not as many Aurelia that can survive when there's competition compared to when there isn't. So even though the Aurelia are winning, they're also kind of losing, which is why this is a negative. Now, the Caudatum, they're losing, right? I mean, their numbers are drastically declined. I mean, compare that to when they were growing by themselves, right? So I want us to understand that this is kind of a lose-lose situation. When this relationship occurs, both of these organisms kind of suffer. Okay. All right. Now there's a term here. It's called the competitive exclusion principle. Competitive exclusion basically says that if you've got two organisms that are competing for the same resource, one of them's going to win and one of them's going to lose. Like one of them's going to lose more, I should say. So if you've got, let's say, lions and cheetahs, both living in the same area, and they're both hunting and eating zebras, well, one of these two species is going to be better suited to survive than the other one is, right? So, that's just part of competition. There's going to be one species that outcompetes the other one. And this happens all the time, with species. I don't care if it's two different cats, competing for the same resource. We can go back to the pond, do different types of fish competing for resources like bluegill and bass competing for things. That's again, that type of competition is called interspecific. It's competition between two different species. Intraspecific is competition between the same species. For example, there's probably not just one lion, trying to eat zebras. There's probably lots of lions. So if they compete with each other, that's a certain type of competition. But when they're competing with another species, that's a different type of competition. So make sure we know the terminology. This graph here is kind of showing us two different species. We've got this we'll call it the blue species and the yellow species. And let's say that these are birds, okay? We've got these blue birds and these yellow birds. And they're competing for seeds, right? We've got, let's say, large seeds, we've got small seeds, and we've got these medium seeds. So the bluebirds, if you kind of look at this graph, their range of seeds, this kind of arc here, it looks like they tend to eat seeds that are of the small variety up to the medium variety. These blue ones don't eat the bigger seeds. They kind of eat these small, medium ones. The yellowbirds, they tend to eat the larger seeds, kind of the medium to the large. So that's kind of their range. But you'll notice right here in the middle, like this green area, that's where they kind of overlap. So this is competition. These birds, even though they kind of tend to eat a different variety of seeds, they both eat the medium ones. So if that occurs, there's going to be some exclusion. One organism is going to be better suited than the other one is. And if you look at this graph on the right, it kind of shows you what happens over time. This yellow bird that at one time occupied all of this area, they were eating all these seeds. Now it looks like they were almost pushed away. So that tells us that this blue species is probably winning. It's probably out competing, this yellow species for these seeds. So if you're the yellow species, now you got a choice to make. You either are going to give up these medium seeds, or you can, maybe move somewhere else, I suppose, where this other competitor isn't there. So, this happens in nature all the time. It's called competitive exclusion. Now, what a lot of organisms do to kind of alleviate um, competitive exclusion is they share resources. And this is a topic called resource partitioning. The word partition means to share. So we've got these, hold on one second, just have to check my text messages real quick. Um, when organisms share, they can coexist a little bit better than if they don't. One of these types of partitioning is what we call temporal. Temporal partitioning basically it's a behavior. So, for example, wolves and coyotes, right? Wolves and coyotes are similar species. A lot of times they live in the same areas, and a lot of times they hunt and eat the same types of prey, things like rabbit and deer and things like that. So you would think that there would be a lot of competition between these two organisms, and there is, but they've kind of evolved different patterns of behavior that will allow them to coexist. Wolves, for example, they hunt mainly at nighttime, whereas coyotes hunt during the day. So if they're hunting the same resource, let's say rabbits, but they're not hunting at the same time of the day, then the amount of competition is lessened. So these are two organisms that have figured out that they can coexist as long as they use those resources at different times of the day or different times of the year, then they can coexist a lot better. They can partition and share that resource. This is called spatial partitioning. We see this a lot with plants. You've got plants that live in the same area. For example, here's two different species of plant. This is called black grama grass. And grama grass is kind of a shallow, it's a grass, so it's not going to root itself really deep into the soil. Then we have something called a tarbush, which is another plant that can have much deeper roots. So a lot of times plants are competing for nutrients in the soil, they're competing for water, and their root systems tend to get really close to each other. So what ends up happening is, for example, if the grama grass only has these shallow roots, it can take up a lot of the nutrients from the shallow area of the soil. Whereas the tarbush, it also can have some shallow roots and it might compete with the grama grass. But what it does to kind of alleviate that is it has much deeper roots as well. So it can get things from the soil, 2-3 meters below the surface that the grama grass cannot get to. So in that aspect, they can live in the same area. They're just utilizing different parts of that area to help them survive. So that's called spatial partitioning. The final one is called morphological. This one is, differences in body shapes and body sizes that will allow organisms to use a resource differently. For example, these are a whole bunch of these different types of birds, these finches or whatever they are. And a lot of them live in very similar areas. They live in the same regions, the same habitats, and they eat a lot of the same resources. But you'll notice because their beaks are all different, it allows them to access those resources differently. I mean, for example, I don't know, this guy over here on the in the upper right, he's got this really long beak, this kind of curvature to it. He can probably access seeds like inside of trees and things like that, compared to, let's say, maybe this guy down here that has this much shorter, much thicker beak. Maybe he can eat larger seeds, whereas maybe this guy here has to kind of eat like smaller things. So because they have those differences, those morphological differences, it allows them to coexist and use those resources in some different ways. So again, this is all examples of resource partitioning that we should be aware of. All right, guys, I'm going to stop the video here today. You might want to rewatch it at some point to help you study, but there will be a lecture note review over this as well. So have a good day.